Hey, everybody. Welcome into the State of Purple. It is Wednesday, August 24th, a gloomy afternoon and evening here in Minneapolis and St. Paul. He's Jack Day. I'm AJ Mansour. We are the State of Purple podcast, bringing you everything Minnesota Vikings on behalf of KFAN and, more importantly, on behalf of SodaStick, our lovely presenting sponsor. Thank you, SodaStick and SodaStick.com. You can get your lovely Minnesota sports-inspired goods, awesome T-shirts, hats, everything you could think of at sodastick.com, and you can get 15% off right now with that promo code KFAN. So a very special thank you to Soda Stick. Jack Day in the house. I already introduced him. I said my name, AJ Mansour, but we're back again, Jack. We have a second preseason game that we can now react to. How you doing, brother?
I'm doing well. I haven't worn this one yet. This is my Can't Stop the Thielen shirt, and that's a little teaser for the end of the show, and we'll get a little debate going on the show.
Yes, we have a big question. I don't know. I just made that up. Maybe we'll call it Jack's Big Question of the Week. Jack's Big Question of the Week coming up at the end of the show. We have a new quarterback to discuss. We also have some player cuts that are ongoing and some that will be more that will be right around the corner. But, Jack, I want to start with that second preseason game. It was a snooze fest. It was the lone home game for the Minnesota Vikings at US Bank Stadium against the San Francisco 49ers, as expected, as we discussed last week. All the starters practiced in that joint practice, the two joint practices with the 49ers, and then 27 players did not dress for the game. So it was many reserves and third, fourth string reserves on both sides of the football. Jack, I know you had family in town. Your brother was back in town. And you were loosely watching off at the bowling alley. That was probably the best way to do it. I was dodging paper airplanes at the stadium because that's what the fans had resorted to. But any big thoughts? I know you've read a lot. You went back and watched some of it. Anything stand out to you from this second preseason game? Because there wasn't a whole lot to glean from it.
My bowling game stood out more than the actual preseason. I bowled over 200 for the second time in my life. I got shot at.
Hang on. Do we bowl often? Like that's good.
I do not. I used to bowl a little bit. We're out at Treasure Island. We used to go out for dollar bowling on Tuesday nights, and I took a class in college. I guess I'll say that. There was one semester where I was a 4.5-year student. So my last semester was literally just to fill in credits. I had fishing, bowling, a health class, and a bunch of just nonsense classes. But I remember there was a time in that bowling class in college, I hit a 198 and I threw a gutter ball on my last frame. And I was like, I could have broken it then, but it was a 206. My best ever it was a 212, I believe, also at Treasure Island. But
super impressive.
It was a lot of fun. The game, it was on there. There wasn't a whole lot. I think the biggest worrisome moment for me was watching Andrew Booth walk off the field. I think that I was like, whoa, that could be back. It didn't look good. And it's, from what I've read, it sounds like it was just kind of a re-aggravation of an ankle issue that he's had. So it shouldn't be as severe. And talking about the preseason, I think there's a lot of people that are kind of bashing what Kevin O'Connell is doing. It's kind of similar to what the Rams have done, where they just don't play their starters. And I think there'd be people bashing it a whole lot more if we were to see a guy like Kirk Cousins or Dalvin Cook play and then get hurt. I think there'd be people a lot more upset if that happened. I get the argument that they might start slow, and you definitely don't want to start slow with the schedule. It's Green Bay at home and then a Monday night game in Philadelphia. Those are two very hard games right off the bat. But a couple good things that did stand out to me. Caleb Evans, he was a fourth-round rookie that he was the guy that Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah was talking about watching film in the dark and kind of questioning the rest of the NFL if they were too high on this guy, and they ended up getting him in the fourth round, and he was impressive. I believe he led the team in tackles. Brian Asamoah, we didn't see a ton of him, but he's kind of starting to show those flashes that he could be. I don't know if he's an everyday starter right now, but I think there could be certain packages put into place to get that sideline to sideline speed out on the field. And I think the biggest talking point from this game, it's the quarterback position, what came following the preseason game with the trade. But Kellen Mond did not live up to the hype after the week 1 preseason game. Sean Mannion, I think we've had this conversation. We know what the Vikings have in Sean Mannion, and I don't think he's a good enough backup if Kirk Cousins were to go down. I know Kirk Cousins is, knock on wood, traditionally stays healthy throughout the course of a season, but we didn't see enough from Kellen Mond. We didn't see enough from Sean Mannion. And I think when we talk about Nick Mullens, and we'll get into that a little bit later, I think he brings a different element where, yes, he might not have the highest ceiling, but he has the safest floor as a backup. And I think that's what you need. I don't think people were cheering and applauding when the Vikings signed Case Keenum, and look what happened when Case Keenum, obviously the season didn't end the way we all wanted it to, but it was still probably the most fun season I've had throughout my lifetime. So it was a preseason game. I think that's the best way we can use to describe it. And I'm looking forward to diving into some real football here. And I think it's like 18 or 17 days now.
Yeah, we're getting there, and we'll talk more about Nick Mullens in a second. I don't want to get too far away though from Kellen Mond. Sean Mannion outplayed Kellen Mond in that second preseason game. That's not saying a ton because Mannion wasn't like blowing people away, but there was flow to the offense. There was momentum from time to time when he had the ball and was moving the team down the field. But with Kellen Mond, there was nothing. Like there was nothing that ever got going. He did have the 2 interceptions, both of which were just terrible. It sounds like the second one might not have been his fault. Somebody broke off a route, maybe a little miscommunication there. But even the way that it happened, it looked, both of them were floated throws that looked like he was kind of throwing them away, like just trying to avoid the pressure by throwing the ball away. But instead of throwing it, 30 feet out of bounds and 10 feet off the ground, he threw it right in the middle of the field, and it landed in the hands of the opposition twice. Preseason games, the momentum, that shift. Who cares about that stuff? But you never want to see a quarterback do turnovers there, and all the momentum and success that he had carried in from that first preseason game appeared to be lost. And I don't know what the difference was, if the flow was different, if they gave him more this time, and maybe his limitations were what they had on his plate for preseason game number 1, and it just kind of had him swimming a little bit in the deep end for preseason game number 2. But we left, Jack, I think that first preseason game, under the assumption that Kellen Mond was going to be the backup quarterback for this team. That Sean Mannion, they're finally going to let him go and get move on and go with the high hopes potential of Kellen Mond, a guy that might have a high ceiling, still has something to learn, but showed that he was competent in the NFL. And then he goes out and proves that he's completely incompetent and left the team in a point where you had already mentioned they went out and made a trade just a couple days later for a new quarterback, Nick Mullens with the Oakland Raiders. We had seen him last week. Mullens, again, it's a conditional 7th round pick. And if I might have my conditions right, the condition is he just has to show up in a game. Does that mean that it could potentially be free? Like, how does that basically, you just,
I think so,
priority? Like, that's a weird, like, again, 7th round picks are not a whole lot of value to begin with.
This regime, clearly. We will say that.
Yeah. But the condition, I believe, has something to do with him playing or appearing in one game throughout the regular season. So if he doesn't, they literally just got him for free. Cool, whatever. You mentioned it, though. I think that they showed interest in him and his competency, the floor. I like the way you put it, Jack. He does not have a super high, may not have a super high ceiling, but he has a higher floor than Kellen Mond and Sean Mannion. And you gave the example, you mentioned Case Keenum. This team, this fan base has in the back of their head backup quarterbacks coming in and having great success for long periods of time. Case Keenum, Randall Cunningham, Brad Johnson. You have these situations where the starting quarterback goes down, backup guy comes in, and they find a lot of success and run with it and go to NFC championship games and playoffs and have all this success. The thing that I think that we forget is there are a lot of injuries and a lot of absences for quarterbacks. I would go ahead and say most injuries and absences for quarterbacks are not season-ending injuries. If the season ends, I don't care if your backup is Gardner Minshew, who everybody was wanting, or if it's Kellen Mond. You're not going to have the same success you would if Kirk Cousins was out for the entire year. Okay, if Kirk Cousins gets hurt early on in this season, this team's probably not making the playoffs. That's the end of the story there. But what they do bring a guy like Nick Mullens in for is just in case Kirk Cousins gets a little stinger, if he has to come out for a couple drives, if he has to leave a game early and can't finish the second half, can Nick Mullens come in and hold on to a lead? Can he come in and move the ball and be competent and not turn the ball over, not give the other opposition gigantic advantage Can he go out and, if he has to start one game, maybe 2 games, can he go out and beat the Chicago Bears? That's what we talked about last week. Can he go out and beat a team that this team should beat whether or not Kirk Cousins is in there? Because we've seen this team lose those games in the past. The Buffalo Bills game rings a bell a couple years ago before Josh Allen was Josh Allen. And they came in, the Vikings were gigantic favorites, and they laid an egg. It wasn't injury related, but we've seen this team lay eggs before. If the quarterback can be competent, you avoid laying an egg. And I think that that's what they see out of Nick Mullens more than anything.
Yeah, and I think what you get in him too is he's a guy, I don't know the exact number. I think it's 4 or 5. He's won games at this level.
Right.
That's something that Kellen Mond and Sean Mannion haven't done. And I think to take your point one step further, the key to the offense, obviously Kirk Cousins, this offense is going to be at its best if Kirk Cousins is doing his thing. But it was similar to when Case Keenum came out there. How can you make a quarterback that might not be as skilled as Kirk Cousins, how can you get him comfortable? And it's getting the balls, find a way for him to get the ball in the hands of his playmakers. And we talked about it last week. This offense, if healthy, is absolutely loaded with playmakers. It was similar for Case Keenum. It was Stephon Diggs and Adam Thielen. It wasn't that he was making the most miraculous throws. There was plenty of times, I vividly remember this, where it just seemed like Case Keenum would just chuck the ball up and somehow Stephon Diggs or Adam Thielen would come down with it. There was a little bit more, there was depth at the running back position, which I alluded to last week as well, because Dalvin Cook got hurt that season. They didn't have Dalvin throughout that season. I think it was Jerick McKinnon and Latavius Murray. It was their 1-2 punch at running back, and it was good enough. If you can find a quarterback that is competent enough and able to kind of, like I said, we don't need him to come out and sling the ball like Josh Allen or Patrick Mahomes and throw the ball 70 yards down the field. Just get the ball to the playmakers out in space, and I think Nick Mullens is good enough to do that. And quite frankly, we haven't seen enough out of Kellen Mond or Sean Mannion to believe that they're able to do that, like you said, against kind of some of the lower competition that the Vikings are going to see this year.
Well, and the other thing is, too, Nick Mullens can come in and run the same style of offense as Kirk Cousins. He can't run it as well, okay? There's no argument there. Doesn't have as accurate an arm, strong an arm. He can't run it as well as Kirk Cousins does. But you won't have to completely change the offense. If Kellen Mond were to be the backup quarterback and he came in, whether it be mid-game or to start a game, you would have to completely rewrite this offense. It would make it much less dynamic. He would add maybe a little element of the running quarterback, but we haven't seen that. I mean, in the time we did see Kellen Mond in the preseason, he looked clunky. He looked robotic. Like, he didn't look like this fluid athlete back there. I don't know if it's because he's thinking too much or what it is exactly, but this talk about him being the mobile quarterback, we all want a mobile quarterback because Kirk can't do it. It's the way of the future. You know, you got Lamar Jackson, all these guys that are doing this now, Josh Allen, Kellen Mond has not shown any of that. Like, that he has that ability to do it. So you don't have to change the offense if the quarterback goes down with Nick Mullens there. So I think it's safe to say, Jack, I think I'm reading between the lines here. I'm assuming that Nick Mullens is the backup quarterback. Am I fair in saying that?
Yeah, and it's going to be really interesting to see what happens with the other two, because if you have a guy like Nick Mullens, who it's a more sure thing, as sure as backup quarterbacks can get, it's a more sure thing than Kellen Mond and Sean Mannion. And do you really want to risk having to potentially lose another depth piece along the offense or defense, wherever that may be, to keep a Kellen Mond or a Sean Mannion? I think with the Nick Mullens trade, for me, it seems like at the end of the day, that's the goodbye to Sean Mannion. At the very least, maybe Kellen Mond would make the practice squad, or they do keep 3 quarterbacks. But in today's NFL, I just feel like that's too hard. There's so much talent on this roster, and we talked about it with the wide receivers and running backs and CJ Ham and Alexander Madison. We talked about it last week. If they're going to keep an extra player at one of those positions, I don't see a third quarterback making this roster.
No, I don't think they're going to keep a third quarterback. I personally would cut them both. I wouldn't be surprised if they tried to get Kellen Mond on the practice squad. And if he gets claimed, who cares, right? I mean, if somebody wants to put him on their active roster for the rest of the season, good luck. That's certainly going to be an injury situation. But I would even say I would rather cut Mond and keep somebody else as a practice squad player rather than keep Mond on that practice squad and have him take up some space there. You have a transitioning offense and defense. So there's a lot of question marks still on how we're going to build depth. We don't have the depth for this team. We've seen that very much in these preseason games, that after those starting lineups go out, there really isn't depth on either side of the ball, really at any position outside of maybe running back, right? You talk running back, maybe defensive line. There just isn't the depth there. You have guys like T.Y. McGill and Ty Chandler who are splashing. Okay, that's your depth guys. You can't keep McGill on the practice squad, but Chandler you could. I mean, that if it's between him and Kellen Mond's out the door ASAP. So I would clear that roster spot. They don't have a tie to Kellen Mond. They weren't the regime who drafted him. It's not a failure on their part. It is probably better for them to say, hey, I'm going to take a chance on a guy I believe in rather than the guy that they didn't believe in. The previous regime who did draft him didn't believe in, and we clearly have not had anything that has changed our minds on that situation either. So we'll see. I mean, I think it's next Saturday or so is when they start cutting down, or when they have to get the rosters cut down. Nope, that can't be.
It would be next week sometime.
Early next week. I think it's usually that Saturday after, but again, the fourth preseason game schedule. I don't know what that's like. When it was 4 preseason games, it was always the Saturday, the last Saturday of the Minnesota State Fair, because Meat Sauce and I would do Saturdays with Sauce out there, and we'd be updating as the cuts would come in. It's probably before then. I don't know the exact date. We'll figure that out. But cuts will come next week, okay? Cuts will come next week. You'll get down to 53. They'll be down there. They'll have some question marks. They'll have some names. I don't know that there'll be any gigantic names cut, but there could be. You never know. But what I do want to ask you, Jack, is with this third preseason game, we have not seen any starters yet. I think that there is a less than 5% chance, but it's not a 0% chance that we'll see starters in this game. They haven't announced it yet. They're kind of keeping it close to their vest. Do you think that there's any chance you see a guy like Kirk Cousins or Danielle Hunter or Adam Thielen out there for this game?
I don't think so. At this point, last week I was questioning it, maybe a little bit more optimistic that we were going to see maybe even like Kirk for one series, half a series. At this point, I don't see it. If that was your plan all along, I don't see a point in throwing him out there for arguably probably the most meaningless preseason game of them all. And on top of it, they're probably still trying to figure out where those cuts are going to come from. So why not get those young guys out there, see what they can do for one more game? And I want to go back to the Kellen Mond thing quickly and say 2 things. I saw some people just kind of chirping at the last regime saying, look at how good Davis Mills is. The Vikings should have drafted him instead of Kellen Mond. And I don't know if everybody remembers this or not, but Houston had Kellen Mond on the phone before the Vikings took that pick. They wanted to draft Kellen Mond ahead of Davis Mills as well. So I don't think it's fair to throw that shade. And I had one more question to throw back to you. With this trade, with the Nick Mullens trade, could you see this potentially as the new regime starting to look ahead? And we talked about this a couple times already on the show. Look ahead at an already kind of cracked up to be a loaded quarterback class in the 2023 draft, and them saying, hey, it's our turn to kind of take a shot. Maybe it's not a first or second round pick. Maybe they do take more of a project caliber quarterback in next year's draft class. But if Kellen Mond's not on the roster and it is just Nick Mullens and Kirk Cousins, I have a strong feeling that this team is going to be heavily doing their due diligence in that quarterback position come the 2023 NFL draft.
Okay, everything you said is correct. But I don't think that it factors in. I think Nick Mullens move was 100% for 2022.
Yep.
It gets them in a better chance to win if a situation pops up with Kirk. Whether Kellen Mond was on this roster or not, I think that they were still going to do their due diligence and still going to probably take a shot in one of those early round draft picks of a quarterback. Okay. Like you said, probably not a first round, but maybe a second round, third round quarterback in this giant quarterback depth field that's coming in. That's probably going to happen either way, no matter what happens to Kirk. Kirk could have an MVP season and they're still going to do that, right? You have to plan ahead. That's part of the GM's job, is see what you have on the field this year, make the best team you can possibly get, but also you need to start planning ahead. So you have this opportunity with a loaded quarterback class to find a guy maybe in that second round, third round that could have a better chance at making the team than Kellen Mond in the future. So I think that Mond, the decision is made on him, whether he was on this roster or is on this roster going forward or not. He's not going to be next year. I think that's a for sure thing. Nick Mullens is probably going to be the same situation, right? I mean, you're going to look to the future eventually, and that might be next year. So I think that Mullens was a this year decision, and Mond the decision's made up whether or not he's on the roster for depth or whatever you need this year. Next year, they're going to draft a quarterback. They have to, right? I mean, it's the plan. Kwesi has not been shy about it when he talks about looking into the two-handed nature of being a general manager, like drafting for players now and drafting for players in the future. So they'll be looking for that. It'll be interesting. I agree with you. I don't think we're going to see starters. I don't think that they necessarily need it. Even if they did play and get one series, then they go and sit for 2 weeks before they go into the game. So you can't really carry into that momentum into that Green Bay game on September 11th. But I am debating whether this game will be more boring or less boring than the second preseason game. I think that's the only question that there's going to be. It's probably going to be equally as boring. Again, I mentioned it kind of in jest, but the second half of that game, everybody was just watching paper airplanes being thrown onto the field and trying to perfect their design. So theirs would, go from the upper deck over the second and not turn around. Okay, that's the catch, right? How do you get it to go straight for this long period of time and land on the field rather than turn around and land somewhere in the first deck?
It's better now than 4 weeks into the season against the Cleveland Browns like it was last season. I will say that. Now, we can make the preseason a little bit fun, I think. We can just keep this quick and short, but is there one player that you're excited to watch? Obviously not a starter, but is there any of the depth pieces that you're excited to watch and can maybe get some of the fans at least borderline entertained with the preseason game?
Yeah, I mentioned his name earlier, and he's stood out a couple times now, so it's not a surprise. But this T.Y. McGill story is a fun one. I mean, this is not a young player. This is a veteran guy who's been there, done that, moved around, and he's had some success in both games in the preseason here. Probably still finds himself closer to the bubble than you want to be just because of depth scenarios, whatever. But if he can go out there and continue to have an impact and go out there and continue to put some pressure on the quarterback. You mentioned Brian Asamoah and how he has stood out. I heard Ben Lieber talking about, I think it was Ben Lieber, 99% sure it was Lieber talking about how Asamoah is standing out and flashing because guys like McGill are keeping him clean. Guys like McGill are putting pressure on the quarterback, getting the blocks off those linebackers so that they can do what they're supposed to do. So McGill is not only getting to the quarterback and getting sacks, but he's also eating up blocks and keeping those linebackers clean so they can do what they're doing as well. So some good things coming from there if that continues. That's the one that I guess I'm watching. How about yourself?
I think it all is similar to what you said. I brought his name up earlier. I think it comes down to Caleb Evans, and I think it's partially because I've seen the secondary depth that this team has had over the last 2 seasons and how it's hurt this team over those last 2 years. And like I said, I think I have a soft spot for cornerbacks that like to come downhill and make tackles because you don't find – I shouldn't say that. I think you have to be able to do that in the NFL, but there's certainly corners that are a lot better in coverage, and that's not necessarily their area or their specialty. And I'm excited to see if that continues of another like physical style game. I think it was 10 tackles. I think he had 1 tackle for loss, and I'd like to see maybe get his hands on the ball, whether that's a pass deflection or an interception. It'd be fun to see, and it'd be better going into the regular season knowing there's a little bit more depth at that cornerback position than what we've seen in years past.
Yeah. Now, Jack, you have also spent your time, perfecting your bowling game this week, but you also spent some time picking some fights on Twitter or bringing up some interesting conversations. Maybe we'll put it that way. You were watching some old Randy Moss highlights, and you posed a question on Twitter that I think we're going to change up a little bit, but I'm interested to kind of see the conversation it lends itself to here. And then, also in the chat. I mean, again, we haven't done a great job of promoting that we live stream these things as we record them. So there's comments flying in, people saying hi and suggesting thoughts or things that we've, left out along the way. So I'm interested to see what the chat has to say about this. I'm interested to see what social media has to say about this. But I'm going to let you pose this question and let us know where it came from as well. Again, you just bored at home watching Randy Moss highlights?
So it actually, thanks to our sponsors, once again, this stemmed from Soda Stick because, as you can see on the bottom of the screen right now, I was wearing my Randy Moss Moon shirt yesterday. And actually, I was talking to my fiance about this, and she didn't know or understand what the shirt was about. So I went through the whole backstory of how the Green Bay Packers fan base used to moon the buses when they pulled in. And that was the original highlight that I pulled up, was what did Joe Buck say? That there was the disgusting act when, and that's what we were watching. So that's how this all started. And I was just kind of sitting there, and that I won't go down the road that it led to, because it led to me watching some Johnny Manziel highlights from Texas A&M, which don't know how I even got there, but it came into my mind, and I was like, I legitimately think this, and I will go on record saying this. I don't think you can put together an all-time wide receiver core that is stronger than the Minnesota Vikings. It's been a position that has been a strong suit for this team for several different eras throughout my lifetime. I know there was some of the old timers on Twitter as well. We're talking about some of the guys that were before my time that I think you can make a strong case for, but AJ and I were kind of talking before the show, and we kind of, to make things a little bit more interesting, we're trying to figure out, if you had to pick 3 all-time Vikings wide receivers to build your team around, who would those 3 wide receivers be? And I can kind of let you answer that, because I think we can have a little bit of fun with this, but I think it's pretty obvious who starts that group out.
Yeah, and again, we're talking roster cuts. We're talking about shaping rosters and how many wide receivers are going to keep. So that's kind of where this stems from, right? They pick 3 starting wide receivers. In this conversation, we're not necessarily talking about, okay, we got to get 1 deep guy, 1 red zone guy, got to get a slot wide receiver. We're just talking about 3 wide receivers. What are the 3 best wide receivers all time in Minnesota Vikings history? If you're building a team, which 3 do you pick to go out there and dominate? You mentioned it, Jack. I think the top one is pretty easy. Randy Moss is going to be on every single person's list. The number 2 might be pretty easy, but the debate can begin there at least. I think most people would put Chris Carter on that list as well. That's not?
I think so. Right? It was kind of my 1A, 1B, or that's probably not even fair. 1 and 2 is a better way to put it, how you just did, but
very respectful number 2.
Yes.
Okay, and then when we get to number 3, that's where the real debate can jump in. You mentioned you called them old timers. I'm sure they love being called old timers. It's a great. I'm sure they love that. But you go to different eras, right? I mean, you've got Anthony Carter, you've got Ahmad Rashad, you have the more current guys, Stephon Diggs, Percy Harvin, Justin Jefferson. And you can look at this any way you want, right? Are you looking at, okay, if you extrapolated Justin Jefferson's first 2 years, we know that they're the best 2 years and they're the fastest, most yards in NFL history. So if you want to extrapolate that, can't really predict injuries, whatever.
Again, I'm a nerd, and this is what I was doing earlier. I have numbers written down with some of these guys, and I was being generous with Justin Jefferson. Randy Moss, number 1, no doubt in my mind, 15,292 yards, 156 receiving touchdowns. Justin Jefferson, if he were to play 12 seasons in the NFL, going off of the first 2 seasons he's had, 18,096 yards for 102 touchdowns. So he's beating Randy Moss by almost 3,000 total yards. And I don't think that should come as much of a shock that he's not blowing the touchdown numbers up quite as much as Randy Moss did, because that was Randy Moss's specialty. I mean, we're not going to see a Justin Jefferson Thanksgiving game. I mean, we do have a Thanksgiving game this year, so maybe we could get that. I would die to see that graphic if he can go whatever it was, 3 touchdowns, 3 catches for 162 yards, whatever that Randy Moss stat line was from down in Dallas, I believe. Before that was when I was 4 or 5 years old, I'm assuming. So I do think Justin Jefferson has a case to be on this list. I know there's people with the longevity, and he's only been here for 2 years. It's hard for me to leave a guy like Stephon Diggs off the list, because quite frankly, he's had the most magical moment of my entire following of this team. And again, I wore this shirt for a reason today, and there were some people starting to put him in terms of the original tweet that I had was talking about keeping 6 wide receivers. I think Adam Thielen has a legitimate case to be in that top 3, top 4 range, just because I know that might come as a surprise. But Jake Reed, Ahmad Rashad, Sammy White, all of those guys, they were in the 6,000s in terms of yards. Jake Reed had 36 touchdowns, Ahmad Rashad 44, Sammy White 50. Adam Thielen is currently at 5,966 yards and 49 touchdowns. So if all he needs is like 6-7 touchdowns and another, give him 500-600 yards, and he's right there with those guys. It's hard to argue for me, because he's been one of the more entertaining players and criminally underrated players, I will say, throughout the course of his career. I mean, he was getting compared to Calvin Johnson, which I think was a little bit silly when he was doing the consecutive 100-yard games. But
right, very different players, but you can't argue with the numbers. Yeah.
Correct.
So here, I think Thielen factors in a couple different ways. You have this conversation about whether or not he belongs in that 3 or just outside of that 3 or whatever, like you just mentioned. I think that he might factor in more so with the Justin Jefferson conversation, because Adam Thielen right now has been a touchdown vulture within the red zone. Not to say that Justin Jefferson is a giant red zone target. He's much more of a between the 20s kind of guy, stretch the field, find the open space. But if Adam Thielen weren't in the picture, Justin Jefferson's touchdown numbers would be better. There's no arguing that, right? If he didn't have a guy who has, I got it right here, Adam Thielen the last couple years, he has 10 touchdowns last year, 14 touchdowns the year before. That's 24 touchdowns that went to somebody else. They wouldn't have all gone to Justin Jefferson, but let's even count half of that. And that really changes those extrapolated numbers that you kind of pulled out with Randy Moss and Justin Jefferson. So, Justin Jefferson is showing early in his career, right? He's done it for 2 years. I think that's good enough to say he's proven that he is an elite wide receiver. You then mix in, this is kind of unfair for this conversation, but it's part of the equation. You mix in what we expect to see from this Kevin O'Connell offense and how it should be a little more high flying. There should be some more aerial attack in this mix. Justin Jefferson's numbers could go up even more. They're talking about 2,000 yards for the season. I mean, all these things are big numbers, big goals to be set. But I think Adam Thielen might factor in to Justin Jefferson's success, and my argument to maybe put him at that number 3 spot, because you would open up some more touchdowns and Justin would get some more touchdowns there. Other guys that we've talked about, Percy Harvin in the conversation, these are all guys that rose to glory and then, at least in Minnesota sports fans' eyes, kind of came crashing down. Stephon Diggs didn't come crashing down, but we didn't like the way that he left here. What you mentioned, I don't know enough about the era before us, Jack. The old timers, the Anthony Carters, Ahmad Rashad. You mentioned Sammy White. I know that those were really good wide receivers. I didn't see a lick of them play, so I can't compare them, and I'm not going to pretend to. But I know somebody in the chat right now has watched them play, or somebody watching on social media has watched them play, and can give us their opinion on whether or not. So let's leave it open ended right there, Jack. Okay, you got Randy Moss, you got Chris Carter as your number 1 and number 2 all-time Minnesota Vikings wide receivers. If you're picking 3 for your roster, who do you put in at that number 3 spot? A lot of honorable mentions going to be on this list as well, but I think it's a good conversation starter. And in the 3 weeks before the season starts, when there's not a whole lot to talk about outside of potential shocking roster cuts, maybe we'll just talk about it for the next week, and we'll report back next week to see if there's anything that we had forgotten, or if anybody convinced us that Adam Thielen does or doesn't belong, or Justin Jefferson shouldn't be in the conversation, or so-and-so was completely left out of our conversation today, Jack. I think that we can agree on the top 2, Randy Moss and Chris Carter. From there, the ball is in your court, listeners, streamers, viewers, anybody. Let us know what you think. Who should be that number 3 wide receiver? All-time Minnesota Vikings roster. The number 3 wide receiver is ... We'll see. All right, Jack, we have a preseason game this Saturday away in Denver. We have 2 weeks before the season starts after that, but it's right around the corner. I know the State Fair is here. We've been excited and / dreading that for a long time, but it's here. It starts tomorrow. If you can believe it, it starts tomorrow. We'll have a lot of great content out at the Minnesota State Fair. We got some Vikings-themed gear. You can also get your gear at SodaStick, sodastick.com, 15% off with that promo code right now, KFAN. I did mention it earlier. I've got my Bud Grant t-shirt on. You said you've got your Thielen one on. Lots of Minnesota sports-inspired goods that you can get, pictures for the wall, t-shirts, polos, hats, anything you could your little heart can desire. You can get it at sodastick.com and take 15% off with that promo code KFAN. Jack, any final thoughts?
I don't think so. Gear up for hopefully more entertaining preseason game than we saw last week.
There we go. All right. Have a great week, everybody. We will see you next week on the State of Purple podcast. For Jack Day, I'm AJ Mansour. For SodaStick, we're going to say peace out.